Hello, everyone, and welcome to a very belated episode of the Retro Man podcast, I
You
guess.
couldn't you
Uh,
couldn't bury the lead a little bit.
nah. Well, I mean,
Welcome
look,
back to the
it's
annual installment of the Rubber
the
Gum Anime
annual.
Podcast.
It's what everyone looks forward to every single year. We're depriving you of our content so that the scarcity makes us more valuable. It's artificial inflation. It's like a holiday now. You can look forward to it. Um, yes, last time, if you remember, last year, Jen and I did a preliminary episode where we talked about our complicated history with the shonen anime Bleach in preparation for the fact that the second part of the adaptation of the resurrected Thousand-Year Blood War arc is coming out in a rather unprecedented display of continuing an anime after it had died, been resurrected, and then died again, and then now is here for a third time, kind of quasi, and we finally finished it. We you can lay this blame squarely at our feet, but also we don't get paid for this, and we both have full-time jobs. So sorry, not sorry. But now we can come at you where we can talk about everything that has been released thus far of the Thousand Year Blood War, of which there are there going to be three or four parts total? I don't actually remember.
The original announcement was four 13 episode parts. Two of
Right.
those are
Okay.
finished. That's what we'll be
Right.
talking about today.
So we are at the halfway point, basically. So basically, this is going to go exactly like our last video did, where we detail in mostly chronological order, but we might jump around a little bit once things get a little less once the linearity is less prioritized. But the first thing that we want to talk about is the biggest, I guess, change in terms of what happened in between the previous incarnation of Bleach and this incarnation of Bleach, that being the technical aspects. I think that we came to the conclusion that the original Bleach anime, for a 300 and however many plus episode shonen anime that had been running for like basically a decade, that the animation for that show was not necessarily like incredible, mind-blowing, and super consistent, but it kept with Tite Kubo's really unique art style and moodiness, especially in its earlier days when it clearly didn't have as much of a budget. But once it got there, it was a pretty consistent through line of quality. But the thing that we left off on is that the teaser for the Thousand Year Blood War arc was just like, oh, we got we got some pretty colors. We got some nice line work. We got some stuff that we might be enjoying quite heavily. So, Jen, I'm going to kick it off to you first and foremost because Lord knows I blabbered enough in the last episode. What did you find the most invigorating about the technical aspects of the Thousand Year Blood War arc? Or if you have any complaints with it, issue those as well.
Okay, here's where I'm at. The visual nature of Bleach is a shifting thing, especially in the
Mm-hmm.
manga. In the early chapters, pages are very detailed to an almost error degree, as in, I don't know how you have the time or strength to do all of this. Um, but as the manga goes along, and you see this in other manga that go for long periods of time, this is not a problem that's unique to Kubo or Bleach, but the art style gains a more streamlined approach in a way that lets them get stuff done more quickly, but it never really loses its luster in how it displays itself. However, Thousand Year Blood War has an interesting visual quality to it that none of the other arcs have, which is that it's kind of filled with minimalism in a way
Mm-hmm.
that previous arcs of the manga are not. And so when they announced that they were going to do this, I thought, huh, how are they going to try to bring to life a lot of the minimalist panels that feel straight out of like, I don't know, maybe it's just because of the nationality of the Quincy's, but I always got a very German expressionist silent film vibe out of what Kubo
No,
was doing
I
there.
totally pick up on that. Absolutely.
And I assume that was intentional to some degree and kind of helped with the workload along the way. And I wondered how Thousand Year Blood War would handle that. And the answer to that is sometimes it does, and sometimes it doesn't. And to get just like a negative quality I have about maybe this part of the show as a whole out of the way, sometimes the expansion of these minimalist panels into fully realized, CG shots with backgrounds and sets and whatever lose some of the flair that the character portraits have. I'm thinking of two very specific images in particular involving Unohana and Yamamoto,
I
which I'll describe
I
later.
I knew you were at least gonna bring up Unohana.
Yeah, I will just go ahead and say this. The look, you know the one. It doesn't hit
Yeah.
quite the same in the show.
I actually broadly agree with what you're saying. I think that like when it comes to the nuts and bolts, like the animation in like the broadest sense of the word, this is the best Bleach has ever looked and sounded. But when it comes to like adapting the style of the manga, I do feel like perhaps the limitations of the previous show allowed them to hone in on what made Bleach's style, which, as we went over in the last episode, as being one of the more unique parts about it. I feel like it was a little bit more adhered to in those earlier sections, whereas here it's not as strong. But if you're squarely going to Thousand Year Blood War for spectacle, you get it. Like when it comes to how the fights look, when it comes to the actual motion of the characters, this is about as good of a like raw quality animation as I could ask for. I am slightly let down by the fact that there is not that more personalized punch to some parts of it. Other parts of it, I feel like maybe broadly speaking, the stuff with, and we'll explain a little bit, we'll kind of backpedal as to what these things are just for the sake of clarity. But like when it comes to the Sternritters and like our antagonists, I feel like everything is rendered in a very stark way that's very honest to the manga. When it comes to the Soul Society and when it comes to things that we've already seen before, I feel like the animation just kind of leans on its general muscularity and the style less, which is not a horrible problem to have, but I do feel like it is present. That's something that we wanted to touch on going forward just because this is broadly true about the whole thing. Like I couldn't detect any differences in quality between part 1 and part 2 basically whatsoever. Like I didn't have like I
No,
didn't there isn't an episode of this either where I was just like, oh, this is clearly the episode where they had the budget cuts, which for all the many advantages of the previous arcs of Bleach, they definitely had those episodes where it was like, yeah, things are a little bit more still framey in these episodes. I wonder what's going on here. This does not seem to have that particular issue, and I am very grateful for that. But it does come with its pros and cons. So that aside, let's get into the thick of shit, the actual Thousand Year Blood War. Now, when we left off previously on Bleach,
previously on.
uh, we left off on the Fullbringer arc, which the tone of which was for us was maybe a little bit more complicated than the consensus of just like that's an arc that starts off with a lot of promise and then just slowly in its second half slowly deteriorates as the final episodes just sort of looms larger as it keeps continuing onward. And while it doesn't completely fall off of a cliff, it just ends and leaves kind of a bad taste in your mouth. So once all of that is put to the side, we now have the Thousand Year Blood War arc, which I don't know how much time is in between these two arcs, like within the
Um,
context of the
right.
story.
Oh, uh,
It's not long, I don't
I'm
think.
not certain. I don't assume it to be very long, but
Me
let me see
either.
if Wikipedia has an answer to that. I don't think so. Let me.
Okay. I don't think so either. And I frankly, I don't think it's really all that important just because none of the character designs have significantly changed or altered or like, but for all intents and purposes, this is basically picking up where everything left off. I'm assuming that there might be like a couple of months in between the stories. Comments, feel free to correct us if you know the difference. But basically, this is kind of a fresh start. And what happens is that the beginning of the arc here, we start off with two Soul Reapers who we've never seen before walking around doing some shit. They have some banter back and forth, and then all of a sudden they get ambushed by a fuck ton of hollows. So already we know something is going wrong. Like there's some spiritual pressure shenanigans afoot, and Ichigo and the gang step in to save these two Soul Reapers, and they beat these Hollows' asses. And let me just say, this is a really small thing, all things considered, but like I can't deny the pang of warmth that I felt when we get that like splash page shot of all the characters and everybody like the gang's all back together again and everybody's beating ass. You know, Chad shows up, both arms beating ass. Orihime's got her shields. Uryu's firing off arrows, and I'm just like, this this is the shit I live for. Like it's a small thing, all things considered, but like seeing the gang operate as a unit. That's some Jake core shit. Some real those who dwell in the dark ass shit.
Yeah.
And I really appreciate like moments like this where you know we harken back to the OG a little bit. It brings me a bit of warmth and comfort.
Here's something I've been thinking about today in preparation
Mm.
of recording this is that the first season of this show is kind of in a Force Awakens type situation
Yeah,
where
yeah.
you
I
have
was trying to
the
think of how to put this, but it's almost like a Legacy sequel.
yeah, it's kind of a legacy sequel where you have the follow-up to something that like was maybe not as beloved, but people still see the potential and the audience is still definitely there. And this project as a whole, I think, does a really good job of like bringing everything you love about the show and continuing it into a new medium while also taking advantage of some of the changes in the trends of how anime is being produced these days to create something that in a lot of places feels a lot tighter and a lot more concise than you would get out of this if it had been made right as the manga was being published. This benefits a lot from just saying at the outset, yeah, it's going to be 52 episodes. You know what I mean?
Oh yeah. Absolutely. Like that's something that I think we were really comprehensive in our previous video. The one thing that I wish we had touched on is the fact that Bleach becomes somewhat infamous, particularly after the Soul Society, and if we're being honest, a little bit during the Soul Society of how long some of these fights tend to last. And sometimes I feel like that's just because of the tactics involved. Sometimes that's the pacing. Sometimes that's how you adapt the manga. But another reason why I think people find some later arcs of Bleach hard to get on board with is that Juego Mundo onward, some of these fights, I'll be blunt, they start to drag. Like they start to last a really fucking long time. And especially like with all of the cross-cutting and all of the different characters in different locations, like it can be somewhat overwhelming at times. I feel like this is a little bit better obfuscated. Like it's that arc and then like a little bit of fake Karakura Town, and then it gets a little bit better after that. Whereas here, I didn't really ever have that problem with the pacing of the fights in the Thousand Year Blood War. Like it's we're jumping the gun a little bit, but I don't think I had a problem where any of these fights lasted for maybe more than like 3 episodes. Whereas like, you know, there are even ones as far back as Soul Society. Like I'm pretty sure Bleach called Ichigo Bleach. I'm pretty sure that the fight between Ichigo and Kenpachi lasts like 6 episodes. Like it's
Yeah.
lengthy. But a lot of it is because these fights are taken out in like excruciating mental detail. A lot of the time, the length, I will argue, it is warranted. And I still feel like that strategy and that sort of level of back and forth is still definitely here, as we'll go into with some of the fights when we explain. But after we get an introduction to all our characters, gang's all here. We go back to Ichigo's room. Um, I mean, like we do see a little bit, like we sort of get some hints on the horizon that something is afoot. There is something going wrong. There's people in the Soul Society. There's like that we're sort of getting the impression that we're on the horizon of something, a sea change in this particular universe. And that is doubly cemented by when our characters are just kind of interacting in Ichigo's room and a fucking Stern Ritter just shows up in his fucking window. Which, when I was reading the manga, I was just sort of like, going through and I was like, oh, wow, hey, they're really just getting into the thick of things already. He's just fucking here. Okay, let's go. And this, like, the suddenness applies doubly so in the show because I can't stress how it's just like, semi slice of life character interaction, just like they're just kind of speculating what's happening. They're having some character beats and moments, and all of a sudden, boom, motherfucker just shows up in his window, and you're like, whoa, okay. I mean, and he's just like, I'm gonna fucking kill you, Ichigo. And then we're obviously like, it's the beginning of a Bleach arc. A mysterious new guy shows up and wants to kill Ichigo, and we're immediately like, well, this guy's about to get jobbed. And I mean, he does. Um, but we get not only a broader portrait than that, is that we also get the impression that something is going on in Quaco Mundo as well, where we cut back and we see some older characters, the some of the Iran that we've met in previous. I don't remember that like antlion looking guy's face. I remember the name of
Oh,
Donda Chaka
Pesce.
because his name is
Pesce?
ridiculous. Pesce, thank you. Two characters we kind of glossed over because they're kind of minor players, all things considered. But uh Pesce and Nell just kind of show up after Ichigo bodies this guy who is, from what we can tell, a Quincy. And previously, in our heads, at least in what we've been shown thus far of Bleach, Uryu, Uryu's father and Uryu's grandfather are like the only practicing Quincy's we've seen in this narrative. So this is obviously like, wait a minute, something's going on here. And so Ichigo beats this guy who does give him a bit of a run for his money at first, but then of course, Ichigo uses his big old fuck off powers. And then we go over into Hueco Mundo, and this is where we start finding out a little bit more about who our antagonists for the Thousand Year Blood War are. And I have to admire Kubo's dedication to making the different antagonists of Bleach insanely distinct. Because when you see the Stern Ritters, you're just like, oh, they're Nazis. Like it's just like these dudes all have German names. They are basically decked out in white SS uniforms. They all have like the most aggressively German names you've ever. I mean, they're called Stern Ritters, which is like, if that's not like a German candy, I don't know what is. Um, but basically, they have come in and fucked up the entire ecosystem of Hueco Mundo, which, in the sort of stead of that arc, Halle Bell, the Iran car, has kind of subsumed a position of leadership. And because Kubo is Kubo, I am assuming that the implication of Halle Bell's leadership and her underlings is that she's just leading Hueco Mundo with a harem of hot Iran car ladies. Like that's, I mean, it's just like,
She already
thank
has
God for
one,
keeping
so
thank God for keeping the sapphic representation alive, Kubo. Um, Especially in shonen. It's increasingly unpopular of a trend, so thank you, sir. But we see that the Sternritters, under the leadership of one guy in particular, who's this fucking freak who looks like Shao Tucker from Full Metal Alchemist, this dude has led like a squadron of guys and just basically taken over this place, killed like half the people there, and are taking a bunch of the Iran cars hostage. and then like doing a bunch of stuff, and a bunch of Halle Bell's lieutenants try to combat him. And we learn that this dude, not only is he a Quincy, but he can absorb like residual reishi, spirit energy from other things, absorb it, and then like take on its form. So basically, he can transform into like he absorbs the Arankar's reishi and Hueco Mundo's reishi and turns into like a weird Arankar Quincy hybrid that looks fucking terrifying. Like just a Cronenbergian fucking nightmare of a character design. And then Ichigo shows up, and we have a fight with this dude who frankly beats his ass at first. Like this dude is, not to be trifled with, but we again initially get the impression that these guys are powerful and that there are guys way stronger than these dudes on the outset of things. And this is basically like this is all set up for basically like really introducing our main villains, which I don't know how to go about talking about this because previously, the only time I heard the villain of the Thousand Year Blood War arc's name spoken was in a Super Eye Patch Wolf video where he pronounces the name like, how I would expect it to be pronounced, which is Yacht,
Can
which
we
is
put
this dude's
the how it's spelled on the screen right now?
yes, it's YHWATCH, I think.
Something like that.
It's something like that. You're just like, okay, but this is Bleach. Everybody's got weird fucking names. This is not new to me. And then the hollow sinking feeling I felt when I'm watching the English dub and they say the word Yuabaha. And I'm like,
Yuhabaha.
fucking excuse me? What is his name?
The way that
And
the actor playing Yamamoto says it in particular is so funny. He just sounds like he's screaming incoherently. Yuhabaha.
so good. It's so good. Uh I'm gonna do my best to pronounce it the way that they do in the English dub, but if you hear me refraining from referring to Yubaha by name, you know why. It's because I sound like a silly fucking fool trying to say it. But we find out that Quincy's are not as extinct as we previously thought. I dropped a hint in the last episode about that, as if you picked up on that. The Quincy's are not dead. We don't know where they've been hiding. Put a pin in that. But they show up in the Soul Society, like totally unprecedented. These dudes just pop the fuck up. There is an entire fucking army, and we see all of these, to use the diction that you utilized in the previous episode, these fucking freaks show up in the Soul Society in the Serete and absolutely start laying fucking waste to it. And the way I think we'll kick things off here with our discussion is that we've not really conferred at all with what each of us thinks about the Thousand Year Blood War arc, both in the like macro sense or just like these parts of it. But I want to say that the initial invasion of the Soul Society in the Thousand Year Blood War, this fucking rules. This is as much as I have enjoyed Bleach in the past, as much as parts of the Soul Society arc, frankly, because every opportunity Kubo and the team doing the anime take to make something more interesting, to take something and completely flip it on its head, to reveal new things about characters that we either didn't get much of a glimpse of before, or characters who we got to know very well, and unearthing new facets of those characters. And also simultaneously, like, I got the feeling that this is sort of the thing that you get as a creator. Like, you don't get opportunities like this often. Opportunity comes once in a lifetime, yo. And Kubo gets the chance to resurrect Bleach because, as we talked about in the previous episode, Bleach's commercial presence, manga-wise and anime-wise, has been diminishing for years. Like, even though it got a little resurgence with the Fullbringer arc, it still wasn't ever what it once was. And so you have this titanic creation in the form of Bleach, and you get one last chance because Kubo went on to try and make another manga called Burn the Witch, which is something he had in development for years, I think. And that got canceled, unfortunately. And I haven't read Burn the Witch, so I can't really speak to its quality or anything. I have seen like panels from it, and I know it's at least drawn excellently. So he gets a chance to come back to his old baby, and he has all this potential, a mountain's worth of it, to do whatever he wants with, to resurrect it in whatever form he sees fit. And man, in this first part here, he fucking goes for it. And I have to sit here and just applaud how absolutely excellent the entire topsy-turvying of the Soul Society section of this is.
Yeah. I'll just go ahead and say it. The first like 8 or 9 episodes of this first part, no notes. At least no negative notes where they just
No.
kind of perfectly, which surprised me because I wondered if they would make any like adaptational changes to how the events
Yeah.
proceed. And there's definitely still opportunities to do that. And one particular thing I really hope they maybe amend a little bit how they explain it. But for the most part, these first 2 seasons are pretty one to one, apart from
Mm-hmm.
some obviously editing and cross-cutting choices that they make. Um, but it's so relentlessly paced in the first few episodes that I was just immediately taken aback to like the best days of the anime, where even in the first episode, which you described in great detail, there's already a hint that something is going on in the Soul Society, and we see kind of the beginning of the big attack that starts the first huge battle, which takes up most of the first season. Um, where like 1,000 Soul Reapers die in, I don't know, 5 minutes or whatever
Yeah,
Yamamoto
it's
says.
it's more than 1,000 die within the first several minutes of the initial Quincy invasion. So, and not to mention, these guys show up, and something that like a fantastic choice is that the Sternritters, like the captain guys, who are all like after they all have like all the different like factions in Bleach have like a naming convention, and these are all like, guys that are named after letters of the fucking alphabet, and the commandants of the Sternritters, they show up and absorb some of the captain's bankais and then use it against them. They steal the fucking bankais of the captains, which the if we weren't super descriptive about how the power sets in Bleach work, everybody in Bleach, all Soul Reapers get a little sword. And it's always got like a specific power to them. And the first power they get is called a Shikai, which unlocks a little form transformation. And then the second power they get is called Bankai. And not everybody has Bankai, but you need Bankai to become a captain. And they steal that. So right out the bat, we get the most powerful characters in this universe having the defining aspect of their power set taken from them, used against them. And I mean, initially when you watch this, it's like if you go in uninitiated, you probably think Byakuya is dead for a couple of episodes because he gets fucking annihilated
He
after his
gets
Bankai gets stolen.
wasted.
I thought he was fucking like I thought he was dead. I was like, oh shit, they fucking killed his ass. And I mean, a bunch of other captains get that their ass handed to them too. Fucking Toshiro gets the fucking tar beaten out of him and gets his Bankai stolen. Fucking like
Who else? There's one
the
more. There's three that get their Bankai stolen right away.
and the lieutenant of the first squadron gets murdered outright. Like he's fucking dead.
Right. Yamamoto's
And
right-hand man is one of the first guys to get knocked.
one of the strongest people in the Soul Society, full stop. And we actually get like a really interesting little like backstory with him and Old Man Yama, which we didn't talk about a whole lot, but just because Old Man Yamamoto, the captain of the first squadron, is like he's he's the head honcho of the Soul Society. He's been involved in the plot before, but never like super directly, like as opposed like just like one time, really. But this is the first time we really see him at the forefront, and he kind of elaborates on their relationship. So it kind of sheds new light onto two characters that we didn't previously know a whole lot about. And I was like, okay. And then like this is obviously posing so much of a danger that old man Yama comes out and guns blazing, literally, and confronts the Stern Ritters and their leader, Yuabaha. And we know what old man Yama's like powers are broadly. Like we know that motherfucker can use fire, but we're not exactly like we've never seen the full extent. Like we've never seen this man's like Bankai before. And now we get to see it. And this shit rips. Like he fights who he
Him using his
thinks
Bankai takes up a whole episode.
it and it's fucking worth it. Like what this is one of the instances where the animation going for a more just sort of well-rounded all over the place approach pays dividends because this shit looks fucking incredible. Just the way that like the floor and just like everything melts as he takes steps and such, and like the way that everything like he'll basically like hold up his blade and the air around it is like affected by just how fucking hot it is. It's like the surface of the sun levels of hot, like a ridiculously outlandish level of heat, and he's just going for it. And then eventually the dude just loses an arm and basically brushes it off. Like he loses an arm, but he's still fighting like a motherfucker. And then we get another instance of like it really goes to show you how great Kubo is at just the art of the reveal. Because in this little scuffle, like he bodies Yuabaha, except he doesn't. It turns out that the guy he's been fighting is just one of the Sternritter commandants whose ability is to transform into someone else, and he's been taking on his appearance. And then the actual guy shows up, and then the most powerful guy in the Soul Society is immediately murdered. Just
Darth
gone,
Mauled.
bisected. He is dead. And again, just as a way to introduce this arc, this is fantastic. Like you don't like in the moment, it's such a great little like just subversion of temporary expectations. And then that happens, and then you're left with the feeling of like, and then basically they're just like, we're leaving, but we'll be back. And then like the Soul Society is in fucking shambles. Like half of it's destroyed. Thousands of Soul Reapers are fucking dead. The two of the most debatably powerful people in the Soul Society are dead, and a bunch of the captains just straight up don't have their fucking Bankai. A couple of them are in like completely critical condition. So we're just left with the feeling of what the fuck do we do now?
But
And
then
then we get to the more, I guess, the grand minutia of what happens is, which is basically an extended training arc for everybody involved in this story, more or less.
yeah, so we learn about a thing called the Soul Palace, which sits above the Soul Society, where some of the original Soul Reapers live and have lived forever because it's
Like
Yuhabaha's goal.
original Soul Reapers.
Yeah, because Yuhabaha wants to go up there and kill all of them. And
Hmm.
so,
Including the Soul King, a character we have not ever seen before, but we know has existed, who is like the I guess the grand patriarch of the realm that the Soul Society exists within. But we don't know any fucking thing about this dude. We never seen him before. We never interacted with him before. Um, and hell, we even have a moment where Eisen, who is technically still alive, who is imprisoned within like the deepest level of the prison within the Soul Society, who is there, and Yuabaha briefly interacts with him, and you get the impression that Eisen is talking to him like he's an equal. So you're immediately like, oh, this is really bad. So then we basically get several different splintering off of different characters, different subsets of characters going off and doing various methods of training, trying to get stronger and what have you. Oh, one thing I did want to shout out is that I knew I had to refrain from saying I'm home when the initial invasion happened and Renji immediately gets his ass beat. Immediately.
Yeah,
It
Renji
was
kind
it
of,
was like he knew. It's like he knew it was a meme.
or Renji. No, but I wanna get into the minutia of what some of these
Yes.
characters are going through because
Hmm.
again, with Kubo, and I said this in the last video, he's very good at making his characters either reveal themselves or kind of stay the same in ways that really work for the changes that are happening around them. And we
Yes.
see that dichotomy with some characters that we've never observed it with before. My personal favorite probably being Komamura, who
Ooh, okay. Yeah, 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 yeah. Let's talk about
skipping
him.
skipping ahead a little bit, the Quincy's eventually invade a second time to basically kill whoever is left of the Gotai 13, the 13 court guard squads. And in the interim, Komamura has gone to this god that he came from.
Yeah, like the head of whoever his clan was.
Yes, the head of his clan, who is like a supernatural being. And his clan has this thing, and it works kind of like the final Getsuga Tensho in a way, where you can sacrifice your life basically for one last major burst of power. And he does that. And it's not so much because I'm describing it in a way that sounds kind of boring and derivative, but it's
Hmm.
executed in the episode that it takes place in a much uh, better way than I'm describing it because Komamura has always been a secret weapon of the show for me. He's always been a
Hmm.
really stoic character who has really interesting relationships with people like Tosin and the other captains around
That
him.
that moment with him and Tosin, like they have a relationship in the Soul Society where it feels like Komamura is a dude who obviously he's like he hides his head in shame when we initially see him, and we ultimately find out that he has this bestial sort of form that he's been cursed with, and Tosin. As a captain is a blind man, and they have a sort of unlikely friendship with one another. As you know, Komamura feels as though he isn't judged or feared by Tosin because of his appearance. So that initial rift when Tosin is revealed to be working with Aizen, that's another reason why that reveal cuts so deeply. And also when it's reprised and they fight again at the end of the show, and Tosin can see him and says, "You're even uglier than I imagined." Oh man, that shit's fucking brutal, man. It's so fucking hardcore. So like I completely agree. I like that they take him and then they just sort of unearth this new facet of him just because I've always felt like there are lots of different aspects of Bleach's world building that go just a little unexamined just because I'm like I've always been more curious about him and where he comes from, and like like seeing him talk to this giant fucking wolf god is like it's very like Dark Souls. Like for him to like get this
Yeah.
power, he's got to like pledge his allegiance to it. Like it's something that feels really like quintessentially in keeping with the world building of Bleach, but also something that like it doesn't feel as though it just sort of comes out of nowhere, but it also feels new. It feels fresh. So you get this sort of new take on this character who you previously thought you knew. And that's not the only time that happens. I think that the fan favorite time that that happens is probably with Kenpachi, which is probably my favorite thing that happens too. I won't lie. Is that it has to do with Kenpachi and Unohana, which I mean, two of the coolest captains of the 13 Court Guard squads. Unohana's been a character who also kind of a secret weapon stealthily. Like she at first like Kubo played the long game with Unohana, and I gotta respect that
Yes.
because at first you get the impression that she's like the white mage, that she's the healer, she's the one, she's the first aid guy, the quintessential person who's there just to deliver like healing and all of that kind of stuff, and is very like motherly and very like quiet and reserved. But there's this detail about her that keeps getting reprised throughout Bleach where like her lieutenant is like bizarrely nervous around her and nervous of her. And you get tiny little sneaks at the fact that Unohana is like secretly kind of a stone cold badass and is secretly like really fucking strong. And like everybody who's in the know is like deeply fearful of her. And you just don't ever really get that like super explored until much, much later, where she shows how actually strong she is and she can fuck shit up. And it turns out that she's not just like, oh, she's that way, but like, no, she is stone cold scary. She's a fucking sociopath. She's terrifying. And then we get this new sort of facet with her and Kenpachi, who are characters who didn't really interact all that much up until this point. And we've always been kind of like, we've known the broad strokes of Kenpachi's story of being like kind of a feral child who ultimately like came across a dead Soul Reaper Zanpakuto that he wasn't able to properly utilize, but he's just so fucking strong that he's been able to keep pace with all the other Soul Reapers because of that. So then we find out that the person who initially found Kenpachi in the wilderness was Unohana. And they both have this kind of primal drive to seek strength and become stronger just because they're basically unparalleled. They're two people who in their respective environments are peerless. Like they can't be combated essentially. And their various they fight each other when they initially meet. And while Unohana is able to like fend Kenpachi off, she can sense internally like this kid has the capacity to become stronger than me. And this has never happened before. I've never encountered anyone I've sensed this potential in. So she, takes him in and essentially fosters his growth as a Soul Reaper in order to ultimately surpass her. So when everybody is scrambling to train and become stronger because the Stern Ritters pose a threat to the Soul Society that's never been seen before, Unohana's like, well, I guess this is it. And fights Kenpachi in a battle to the fucking death in order to make him, Kenpachi, the strongest version of himself. And, we've known throughout the entirety of Bleach that Kenpachi is like the baddest, coldest motherfucker alive. Like, maybe not the absolute strongest, but like the most bestial, the most primal, the most dangerous and unpredictable. Whenever that dude shows up, shit is about to go wrong. And they fight each other in this battle. And Kenpachi is like, he feels this like desire to fight her, but feels conflicted just because he is the only person who's been able to match her. So they have this really weird, tenuous connection. And throughout the fight, Unohana is murdering Kenpachi and then immediately healing him. So he keeps blacking out and thinking that he's dying, and then like comes to and is like, "Whoa, wait a minute. What the fuck happened?" And then keeps coming back to fight her over and over and over again until he's actually able to beat, kill, and ultimately surpass her. And like, this is just
This is what
prime.
shonen is all about.
This is exactly what makes shonen stories fucking cool. Because on the one hand, it's just like Unohana's cool. I like Unohana. I don't want to see her die. But at the same time, the prospect of seeing Kenpachi actually get stronger and you kind of get it's not stated outright when they're fighting, but you get the impression that's like maybe if he gets stronger, he can actually finally use his Zanpakuto in the way that other Soul Reapers can. And again, put a pin in this for much, much, much later. But once he's able to kill her, it's just like this is something that like Kenpachi as a character has been a great example of a phenomenon you pointed out with is that like Kubo's at his best writing wise when he's able to take incredibly static characters and sort of rub them up against a bunch of other different static characters and create an entirely different conflict and dynamic and potentially a history out of those things. So, like, do I think that when he was writing the Soul Society, Kubo had in mind that Unohana and Kenpachi knew each other for hundreds of years? No. Do I think he did a great job at making the best of a bad situation and being like, I think I can make something out of these two? I think he makes basically does a great job where tons of other mangaka would totally fucking fail. And that happens in little bits and starts after the invasion of the Soul Society happens, is that we keep getting like details, character information, things that are alluring, interesting, and make me feel as involved in this show as I have been since Soul Society.
Yeah, I mean he's kind of a god of retcons. And speaking of retcons, there's one big
Ooh.
one that we haven't talked about, but one that
Mm-hmm.
comes up with the Kenpachi and Unohana duel, which is
Yes.
that we learn more about the history of the Soul Society, which is that basically
Right.
the oldest Soul Reapers were a bunch of fucking crazy barbarians that were just killing people all the time.
Which explains why the Soul Reapers and the Quincy's had a rift to begin with, because the whole thing with them is that initially they are both, beings that oversee the destruction of hollows to keep the peace. But the difference between the two of them is that Soul Reapers, when they don't really necessarily like kill hollows or like spirits, are always like they'll use like the butt of their sword to like send them into the next sort of plane of existence. So they don't eliminate souls necessarily. They send them on the path through the afterlife that's more like a cycle. Whereas the Quincy's take them out of the equation altogether, and they potentially disrupt the balance between the world of the living and like the Serete. So that was why initially the Soul Reapers put the Quincy's out of commission, is because this ideological difference between the two of them and the potential like disruption between worlds would cause the complete destruction of the world of the living.
Yeah. And then let's talk about where our main characters go. So
Yes.
Ichigo and Renji get shot up to the Soul Palace in a rocket by surprise. The Shibas are back, which is just a delight, honestly. I completely
Yeah.
forgot that that happened because it's been so long since I've read the manga. And they
Mm-hmm.
tease it so well in the show, like right at the end of the episode, you see like the backs of Ganju and
Yep.
oh hell, what's her name? What's the sister's
Uh,
name?
I don't remember, but I just remember seeing her character design and being like, "Oh, hey, look
Kukaku.
at
You see
that!"
Kukaku
Yes,
and
yes.
Ganju. So Kukaku and Ganju send Ichigo and Renji up to the Soul Palace to have their training arcs. They go to the Royal Palace and they get trained by a bunch of people who have all kinds of different functions. So one guy is like the inventor of Zanpakutos, and one is kind of the Unohana of this world, where she's the ultimate healer. There are a couple of other characters there too. And these people are some of Kubo's most vivid designs yet. I mean it. In a world that is populated by so many great, I'm going to put a pin in that. In a world that is dominated by so many great character designs, it's kind of amazing that Kubo gets some of his best ones out of the Soul Palace team.
Yes. The who are like specifically, I'm pretty sure they're just referred to as like the secret captains. Like they're the of squad, like do they have
Squad
like a
Zero or something.
squad
Yeah,
zero?
Squad
That's right.
Zero.
And they're all like as strong as the previous captains in the Soul Society, if not stronger outright. And they basically just sort of like guard this particular realm. And I don't know about you, or I don't know how familiar you are with what I'm about to compare it to, but like this whole aspect here, like huge Dragon Ball Z vibes, like immense Dragon Ball
I can
Z vibes,
see
like
it.
Goku going to train with the Supreme Kai to very similar vibes. Though I do think the minutia of this is a little bit more detailed. Like there's that one, like she feeds them all the food, which
Yeah,
looks
because that's
like
like
low key made me
Unohana's
hungry as fuck.
Unohana's mentor is there,
Yes,
as well as the
and
person who
she's
invented
cool
Zanpakuto
as hell,
toes,
big lady.
and
She's like fucking she's gonna be one of those people that people obsess over, like that Resident Evil 8 vampire lady, because she's just like she's just big lady, she's big hot lady,
yeah,
like
yeah,
hell yeah. And that one dude, the inventor of the Zanpakuto, is like dude is like I'm not sure how to put this more elegantly, but like something I've always appreciated about Kubo is the fact that like he's way more willing to make a cast of characters that are willfully racially diverse in a
yeah,
way that like feels really kind of punkish and just like interesting and like flavorful, but also like without tokenizing the characters or anything. So I appreciate that even in like this late stage, he's still varying things up in like every way possible. Because I mean, in this arc alone, there's literally like 100 characters. Like there, like every
yeah,
surviving character from Bleach in the story beforehand is in this at least a little tiny bit. Like Rukia barely has a speaking line in this first season. Like there is so many fucking people here. So appreciation for Kubo, just like still this late in the game, able to make interesting, cool sets of diverse characters and without feeling like he's repeating himself somehow. And there's like
yeah.
fucking 30 individual Stern Ritters who are all unique and cool in their own right too. So like what the fuck?
Yeah, I mean, and so the first season, I will say, the first season kind of trips a little bit in its second half after the battle is over. Because for one, the episode that has Kenpachi and Unohana fight is kind of annoyingly intercut with Ichigo and Renji starting their training arc.
I know every single time it cut back, I was just like, this is not the first time this has happened in this show where it's putting too many of its dramatic eggs in too many dramatic baskets and cross-cutting between all of them. And this is maybe one of the most egregious offenders of like, I care way more about the stakes of this. Like Ichigo and Renji training, I know where that's going. I don't know where Unohana and Kenpachi are going, so please take me
But
back.
I will say they do wrap it up in an interesting way because the guy who creates Zanpakuto Toes is ready to train Renji, but kind of immediately looks at Ichigo and says, "No,
And it's
you're
like,
not that
no.
guy," and kicks him off and sends him all the way back down to Earth, and he lands on his father's doorstep. Um, which leads to an interesting two-episode arc where we learn something that we never learned before about Ichigo's mom, which goes
Mm-hmm.
into, and I can't believe I'm saying this, a two-episode long flashback that completely works for the narrative of where this
Uh-huh.
season is going and where the show is
I
going.
I have I have a feeling that even though we didn't confer beforehand, we're going to have very similar thoughts on this arc overall based on where this is headed. But I have to say, like, I have a strong set of limitations when it comes to my thoughts on where they go with Ichigo in this arc. But this aspect, which is in principle, like in theory, you pitch this to me and tell me all of the parts of it that are going to be included in the story. This is the part of it I would bet most of my money on me thinking is the worst. And it ended up being the best part, at least relatively speaking, of this aspect of the Thousand Year Blood War, where we find out that not only is Ichigo's dad a Soul Reaper, Ichigo's mom was a Quincy. And I have one very large problem with it. It has nothing to do with Ichigo's mom and more has to deal with our main villain. But I'll circle back around when we actually talk about Yuabaha.
Yeah, that hasn't
Um,
happened yet, I don't
yeah,
think, so we can brush that off for
no,
now.
we can move that aside for now. But I like this little development. I I'll get away what I don't like in principle is that My overriding thought on this arc so far, and at least what I know about what happens next, is I feel like for all the improvements that Kubo absolutely, totally, 100% made for this, and what makes this in the upper half of the arcs of this show for me, like there is enough enjoyable here to get a substantial, worthwhile amount out of. But there is a lot of emphasis placed on Ichigo's shoulders in this story. And I really feel like it would be so much better if it wasn't. Like
Yeah,
they
I was
make
about to say
Ichigo.
Ichigo is kind of the weakest character of this season after the first
Mhm.
episode.
He and what's weird is that like he's still, showcasing his personality. He's still cool. He's still the Ichigo that we know and love. But the thing is that a weakness before is that like, a lot of debate goes on in the community around this show talking about plot armor and how Ichigo is, invincible and all of that. And that is a shonen problem that I feel like is way more indicative of the genre, but the real core of what I think is the issue with it, people aren't that don't pry like they don't probe quite deep enough to get to the heart of it, is that there's just too much narrative importance placed on Ichigo's shoulders to the point where he is always the answer to every problem that the narrative will encounter in some of those older arcs. It just doesn't leave any room for the interesting solutions that Kubo is great at coming up with typically to actually like flourish, because we always circle back around to the answer being Ichigo. And this does feed into that. But like a lot of the great things about Bleach, it's a thing that conceptually feels like it shouldn't work, but in execution, this one thing does. I like the development of the relationship between Ichigo's mom and dad, just because like getting to see that is satisfying. Like I
Yeah.
always kind of feel like Ichigo's dad as a character was always somebody who, like, that was one of the first times where a Kubo retcon felt a little bit too much for me, even as a child to handle, where I was just kind of like, okay, I don't feel like this was maybe in the cards when you started writing this, but sure. And then he just kind of gets tossed aside and then gets pulled back at the narrative's convenience. And that's somewhat true here. But we still see like why somebody who is in Ichigo's mom's place, where she is like this, she's a member of this like family of Quincy's, and like, they're really harping on about like bloodlines and stuff, like a lot of important family shit. And she almost gets killed. And basically, or
Well,
no, she
okay,
doesn't
she
almost get
gets
killed. He almost
attacked.
gets killed and then saves him. And then the reverse happens, I think.
Yeah. Well, one of them gets attacked by one of the experiments that Aizen is conducting
Right. The
that
the
he and Gin
hollow
and
white
Tosin.
or black. I don't remember what it's named.
Yeah, it's like a black hollow or something. It's a new type of hollow that has
Yeah.
been unleashed, and it attacks his mom, and she gets like poisoned, and
Mhm.
Ishin takes her to Urahara, who comes up with a convoluted way to fix it, which is kind of another problem I have with this season, is that Urahara is a Deus Ex Machina
Oh
machine
my
this time
God.
around.
So bad. So bad.
He okay, so just a list of things that Urahara does. He finds Grimjow and gets him to kill the first big Stern Ritter that everybody fights in Wako Mundo. He
Sure.
this is the least bad offense. He figures out that Ichigo's Bankai is not able to be stolen, and so tells everybody to hold the fuck on and let Ichigo get to the battle, which again
Hmm.
is fine. That makes sense with literally everything we've heard so far, because Ichigo having hollow powers has always been a thing, and him figuring out
Yeah.
that absorbing the hollow powers like fucks up the Quincy's is the thing that anybody could kind of figure out just by noticing it. And so I don't really mind that as much. But
It's like
then,
Chad and the Fullbringers, where it completely makes sense, so you don't
yeah,
really
yeah, yeah, yeah.
mind.
The maths.
Hmm.
Um, but the worst one is that he gives everybody an ibuprofen that brings back their bankais.
Okay, I'm glad we talked about that, because like they explain it by saying that holothize their Bankai, I think is what he says.
Which again, the math is mathing, but just the way it happens, he like hacks the phone and is like, "Hey everybody, I'm gonna supply drop you some ibuprofen. You better take it quick. It's gonna help you turn this around."
It's like he's one of the sponsors in the Hunger Games and he's sending like a care package drop to one of the district fucking players. It's like it gave me that exact same vibe. Um
Yeah.
which is like there are in the Thousand Year Blood War thus far, there are just as many instances of Kubo Deus Ex Machina ing in a way that I feel like helps the story, and also in a way that I think hurts it. There's like sometimes it's selective, sometimes it's both at the same time. It's the I think maybe the most egregious example is it has to deal with Zangetsu. Um,
I
which
don't know how I feel about this one. I go
so
back and
far,
forth, honestly.
at least thus far, if no further information is revealed to me about this, I don't think I like it
Hmm.
because it does two things. Basically, Zangetsu, the spirit within Ichigo's original Zanpakuto, who we've been seeing since the Soul Society, is actually supposed to be our main villain of this story, Yubaha. Kind of
Yeah.
like not actually, but also
Well, no, 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 no.
sort of like
It's
the yeah.
Zangetsu is the source of his Quincy powers, which
Yes,
for
he is the
everybody
source of
comes from
all of Quincy
Yuhabaha,
powers. Like all of the Quincy's are connected to him, so that does make sense. I'll give it that.
but it's weird.
It's very it gives me that like, you know, Phantom Menace, all of the battle droids are connected to the same network. So if we blow up the computer, then all of the battle droids go. It's like that kind of sort of like you can tell that that's going to be a thing that's utilized later down, just for the sake of narrative convenience. But like this aspect not only is introduced as like, oh, it's the source of his Quincy powers, but also, as it turns out, he has been purposefully limiting Ichigo's power set and making him weaker so that now he can go unrestrained and not have the limitations put on his power. And I'm just thinking this whole time, I'm like, Ichigo? You
Ichigo?
you made him not reach his full potential? This motherfucker is like defeating the most powerful beings in any universe, and we're still pulling this bullshit of just like, well, he actually hasn't reached his full power level yet. And I'm like, oh my God, can we
It
just
it
not do that? Because I think it would be interesting instead to be like, let's just say he's the source of Ichigo's Quincy powers or whatever. And then now, in order to sever the connection between him and Iwabaha, he has to get a new Zanpakuto, which he does anyway. So I don't know why this isn't the approach that they took, because if Ichigo had to gel with a new Zanpakuto, for me, that sort of absolves Kubo of any like the weight is off his shoulders of having to invent a thing for Ichigo to do to get stronger so that he can fight in this arc. Because that's the thing with like most arcs of Bleach is that Ichigo at the very beginning, you know, he's got to go through some minor little training snafu in order to be at least on the level of who we're going to be fighting in this particular arc. And when you have literally made him as powerful as Hollow Ichigo fighting Aizen, it's really difficult for me to believe in any capacity that like he's topped out, man. His potential is
yeah.
realized. Like we cannot keep doing this thing where we keep inventing reasons for it's like actually he's only half as strong as he could be. And so it's like, let's just have him get a new Zanpakuto, and maybe he doesn't gel with the spirit inside of it. And then eventually he does. And then that's what makes him fulfill that sort of contract, but it's messy. I don't love it, but it's not a deal breaker for me.
No, and it almost gets to an interesting metaphorical endpoint because they say that the hollow within Ichigo has been the real source of his power all along, which is a
Yes,
really compelling idea. But
I like that.
the hollow Ichigo character has been completely depersonified, so it doesn't like hit as hard when we see that represented
Like
as just like a blank white body that kneels before him.
he's like a like Hollow Ichigo goes from basically like a character, like an inversion of Ichigo, who's like a manifestation of some of his darker impulses in the earlier parts of the show, to being like an out and out metaphor. So it doesn't carry that same weight that you would want it to have at this point when that little bit is kind of subverted. So I agree. I like that in concept. I just wish that it was like maybe focused on a little bit more, or maybe you do away with Zangetsu and that whole thing to begin with, and Hollow Ichigo becomes the spirit inside the thing, and that also makes Ichigo super unique. I don't fucking
Yeah,
know.
yeah, 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 yeah,
Or
yeah.
and like gives
There's
him some special powers. That would be nifty. I'd be okay with
the
that.
long and short of it is there's a better way to give Ichigo a new sword, which is a thing that we've
Yes,
always said about every single arc of this show.
basically, it's true. But that said, he does get that little blank slate Zanpakuto and then gets a new sword. Two swords
Two
technically,
swords.
because he's a Quincy and a Hollow and a Soul Reaper, so he's got multiple weapons. It makes sense, kind of.
But
Um,
yeah, that's the
so
end of
yeah, we have
season
that part,
one. That's the end of season one, is Ichigo getting his new power
and
and he's ready to fight.
we it's a little rocky there at the end, but I think overall the first part of this season is like largely I think it's pretty great. Like
Yeah.
it fulfills all of the promise I would want the introductory part of this final bit of Bleach to fulfill. And I was mostly like I would say it's a bit generous, but if I was rating these parts, I would give it like an 8. Like it's really, really great. It showcases a lot of new facets of this world. I'm really intrigued. The animation's fantastic. And yes, it does have a couple little plot problems, but frankly, I expected that. It's Bleach. If you don't expect that, then you're probably watching the wrong television show.
Yeah.
So that's okay. And then part two.
Part two.
Part two, or as I like to call it, Karakura Town Mark II.
Yeah.
Because
So let's
that's
talk about
basically
this.
what this is.
Ichigo is still kind of training with the Zanpakuto Adventure guy, but back on the Soul Society, the second attack has begun. The Quincy's are back. It's been 9 days. They said that was going to happen because the Quincy's have this fun little
Oh,
poem that's like,
yeah, where
Yuhabaha
the
will gain
main
his
leader guy,
power. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
it's like his power after 900 years, his mind after 90, and his strength after 9 days. Like it's something like that. But we also find out that this little Quincy poem is tied back into Ichigo's mom's death, in that
Yeah.
the reason that she died on that day when
Wait,
she
that hasn't
was
happened yet.
facing
That
that.
hasn't happened yet.
Oh, okay, okay, all
I
right.
don't think that's happened yet, unless I'm misremembering things.
I could
But
be as well.
just to go back to the start of part two,
Hmm.
second Quincy invasion happens. The Sternritters who stole the captain's Bankais are sent for round two,
Mm-hmm.
with their initial victims, and the
Alongside
Oryu
who
twist.
has who has pivoted in a quite unexpected heel turn. Hmm. What could this mean?
Yeah, Uryu has switched sides. He's joined Yubahaba and he's gonna fuck shit up.
He's joined
But
Yo Gabba Gabba.
he's joined Yo Gabba Gabba and he's gonna be playing drums for My Chemical Romance. Uh Early highlight of the second part is that Kyoraku gets to fight one of the higher ranking Sternritters and
Yep.
bodies. which
So awesome.
it's just always a joy to get to see Kyoraku fight. He's one of the
Yeah.
best personalities this show has, and seeing him like really take the gloves off now that he's the head captain and Old Man Yama is dead is just really fun. It's again like
Yeah.
peak shonen. You want to see the pacifist have to like rise up and do the thing once his position is kind of compromised.
I mean, it's the Unohana trick all over again, where you take the serene, against type character and you totally flip the script on him. And you know what?
Yeah.
I gotta say, like, that is super cool. And that's not the only like cool thing about a lot of this, is that I have to say, like, I joked and said that it was like Karakura Town Mark II. And we talked about the idea that there are certain Bleach arcs where they suffer from the notion that they are too similar to an arc previous. And I did joke, but that's not really my issue with this part, honestly. I feel like there are enough variables at play to make this interesting, and my mind isn't always going back to the Karakura Town arc. Like it's not like Hueco Mundo where I'm like, yeah, I do think the similarities end up hurting this more than it helps it. Whereas this is just like, no, these are just characters with it's really less that they have like it's the same thing and more that they have the same strengths, in that it's just like two sets of people with really specific power sets fighting against each other in really creative, really fucking absurd ways. Like Kubo has always been pretty good at coming up with individual power sets for characters, but it's been apparent ever since Hueco Mundo, I feel like, that he's really had to reach for like specific power sets in terms of creativity, because it's like, in the first thing it's like, oh, Hitsugaya's got a fucking ice dragon. That's cool. And it's like, oh, and Byakuya's got like flower blossoms and they're all swords. It's like, oh, that's cool. It's like, oh no, but like this Arankar can like change the flow of like time, and like this like just the wackest shit imaginable. And
There's
that goes tenfold for the fucking Sternritters, who break out some of the most high concept, absurd power, like JoJo's Bizarre Adventure King Crimson levels of like, how the fuck did you think of this?
Yeah, and I honestly think that's a strength of this arc is that he has to
I do
get
too.
so imaginative that he's practically leaning on metaphysics in a way that he never has before, and in a way
And
that
it makes them more intimidating because their
yeah,
powers are so fucking Lovecraftian that you're like, wow, these guys really do feel like they are from another fucking dimension. Which, by the by, we also discover that the place that they've been hiding is the shadow of the soul society.
it doesn't matter.
Whatever, man.
I will say
It
that is the one place that kind of accurately recreates the visual style of the manga in this
Yeah,
section, where that
that's
part
true.
of that location is really leaning on the, like I said, the kind of German expressionists, like really bright colors, really minimal location type thing.
Oh
So
yeah.
that's a major highlight for me. But that the metaphysics stuff is also contrasted with people who have the simplest powers that are just cranked up to an insanely strong degree. I'm thinking of
Mm-hmm.
Kensei, whose Bankai just basically gives him a knight's suit of armor that he just
Yep.
uses to do hand-to-hand combat. And then one of the Stern Ritters, whose power is just that he has a gun.
Like again, one of the Stern Ritters is just like, yeah, I shoot fire. It's like, oh, that's refreshingly stripped back.
Yeah, like yeah, it's refreshingly stripped back. There's that guy, there's the luchador guy, although he gets incredibly fucked up as his fight goes on.
And his little like ringside cheerleader dude who gives him extra power, who ends up getting
James!
fucking
James!
wasted. James gets fucking wasted.
He looks worse than Chucky by the end of like Child's Play 3, but he's still kicking.
Yeah, that's actually something I is the like, because this is going like straight to streaming and stuff. is the age restriction on this higher than Bleach was previously? Because I could swear that they get away with like way more outlandishly violent shit in this than they do in the original show, which for the record is still a lot.
Yeah, I think they maybe compensate it for it by like mostly turning down the sexuality of most of it. There's obviously the one character in Squad
Which
Zero
I
that
was
has
gonna
a bit
say,
of that appeal, but
which is funny
that's
because
it.
it's the first time in Bleach where on screen, canonically, we do see a character that fucks. Like, it's not alluded to, it's not referenced, it's not talked about. It's like, oh no, she fucked and killed that guy.
But
That
they
happened.
could have it could have been turned up to TVMA. I'm honestly not super sure. But yeah, I mean, I already kind of skipped ahead a little bit and talked about what happens with Komamura.
Mhm.
Kyoraku has a great fight. Everybody gets their Bankais back.
Because of the ibuprofen.
Byakuya and Rukia have a great moment together where Rukia stands up to the guy that Byakuya couldn't fight.
And uses her Bankai. That's been something we've been waiting to see paid off.
Yeah,
Hell yes.
it's great. Like I can't stress enough how much I missed Rukia in season one, but they definitely
Yes,
made
very
up
much so.
for it. They definitely made up for it with this appearance by putting her with somebody that we haven't seen her with in a long time, who's really important to her, and that's
Yes.
Byakuya.
Also, Soyphone's lieutenant, like his sister is like about to be like murdered, and he steps in to try and like, kill the Stern Ritter who's trying to do that shit. And then Soyphone shows up later, gets her Bankai back. God, yes. God, I love
Yeah,
Soyphone.
it's still so ridiculous. It's so funny to me that that's like easily in the bottom half of ridiculous powers, but just because of the way it's executed, I still think of it
Mm-hmm.
as one of the most ridiculous.
No, I can never get over it either. It's just like big ass gun. Um, oh, I mean, okay, the first part of like the Shikai didn't really have much to do with the Bankai, but oh, okay, whatever you say, dude.
But let's talk about easily the highlight of this second part for me, which is Kenpachi fighting a small child.
with with a fucking meat cleaver.
So it starts out in a really interesting way. There's a Stern Ritter who arrives, who attacks Yachiru, whose power is
Which
ostensibly
first mistake.
whose power is that he can erase himself from your memory, kind of like the silence from Doctor Who. Um,
Yeah, yeah. Oh wow, yeah.
and so he attacks Yachiru, but Kenpachi shows up and just immediately chops him in half, which we think,
Mm-hmm.
okay, cool, Kenpachi's back. But then
But
this small child who looks like he belongs in My Hero Academia walks out.
he really does. Shows up and turns people's bones into cookies.
He shows up and reveals that his power is just that whatever he imagines becomes true. And this is what I was talking about with like Kubo just having to straight up lean on metaphysics to come up with new ideas for powers. But it works so well because it's just so bizarre. He turns Yachiru's bones into cookies and breaks her arm and
Ugh.
and then tries to drop a meteor on Kenpachi.
Who Kenpachi naturally is like, how do I solve this problem? Cut it, cut it in half. How else would I do this?
And so
And
he
so
summons.
he does it, and then he gets fucking transported into space. But because Kenpachi is Kenpachi, he makes it because ain't nobody's gonna take that motherfucker down. Just not
He
gonna happen.
finds a way.
Life finds a way.
Life finds a way. But and then another highlight for the fucked up perverts of the world is the
Hell yeah.
is the harem of girls that shows up to fight Toshiro, which poor guy just keeps getting all of the I don't know how to describe it. He just keeps getting
All,
harassed by so many women. I kind of feel bad for the guy.
just like women who are just constantly throwing titties in his face. And there is not a character in Bleach who fucks less than Toshiro Hitsugaya. That dude that I'm not even sure that man knows what sex is.
He is ace and proud. But anyway,
Mm-hmm.
there's a little gaggle of Gorals that show up, one of whom can turn people into zombies,
Mm-hmm. There's
which is
and there's Giselle, Bambietta. I can't
yes.
remember the names of the other ones, but
Candace.
these little
So
bitches
wait,
are freaks.
there yeah, fucking freaks. There's Bambietta, Candace, Giselle,
Candish,
Meninus, and
sure,
Lil Toto.
sure.
I hope that's not spelled wrong. Who all gang up on Kenpachi after he's beaten Grammy and turned him into a brain, which I
Yeah,
swear to
because
God.
apparently it
Okay,
turns out
can
that
I
he's
say
just a
something
brain who
insane?
imagines a body for himself, which is
Can I
kind of awesome.
can I say something insane?
Please.
I read a short story in like a spooky stories for kids collection in high school, and it was or in elementary school, and it was not one of the popular ones. And I
Okay.
remember a short story where this kid goes to a fortune teller and she like curses him and says that everything he says will happen. And
Oh
he
no.
does exactly that. He like at the end of the story, he turns his best friend into just like a brain that is
Oh
just like
no.
flopping around on the ground. And I thought, there's no fucking way. But if he did, I see you.
That's fucking hilarious.
I see you, Kubo. So, and there's an interesting wrinkle there where like the zombie girl gets to Toshiro and like
Hmm.
takes over his body and sends him after Mayuri along with a couple other people. I think she gets Kensei and maybe Shinji. Mayuri shows up and is like, I'm gonna do some complicated chemistry shit. So no, your zombies are my zombies. That part was easily
And
the weakest of all the
yeah,
fights of this one.
and he shows up and he's got the fucking Espada with him, who he's reanimated
Oh
because
yeah,
of
that's
what's
pretty
his name?
cool.
Oh yeah, one of my favorite really stupidly complicated Bleach names, the pink-haired Espada scientist, Cieloporo Grands. He uses the tech from his lab to reanimate the Espadas, like Barrigan, the axe guy is back.
Yeah.
Fucking Charlotte, fucking like basically like a bunch of them are back, and he's been able to like manipulate them so that they are on their side.
Yeah. Which is cool. I like seeing that,
Yeah,
despite it
that's
being
okay.
easily like kind of bottom tier of the fights, just because
Yeah, it just kind of happens.
Kubo kind of sets it up for Mayuri to immediately knock it down in a way that he's kind of always done. And so it's
Yeah.
kind of more of the same. Um, but then we go back up to the Soul Palace because Yuhabaha is using the second invasion as a distraction to head straight for the top. And we get to see
Yes.
Squad Zero fight, which is where we really get into some metaphysics
Oh
stuff.
man.
Because the leader, what is his name? What's the guy with the paintbrush? The Epic Mickey
Oh,
paintbrush?
shit. Hold on. I've got it right here.
Ichibe. Ichibe.
Yeah, there you go. There you go.
Because they've all had something that they've like created to be a part of the larger Pantheon universe stuff. Ichibei is about names. Tenjiro is about Zanpak, or Oetsu is about Zanpakuto. Tenjiro is like the Kaido master, so they know all the magic. Um, and then there's another one who's all about like the artificial soul and healing shit. And then there's one who's like a fucked up puppet master who has all
Uh,
kinds of weird shit going on.
that's some fucked up shit, honestly.
But Ichibei and Yuhabaha fight, and this is easily the weakest part of this season for me, which is that it
Yeah.
ends, even though we know it's the middle of the story, it ends on a really like
Climactic
neutral.
note.
Yeah, it ends on a kind of anticlimactic note where okay, Ichibe's power is that he can like steal names, right? So he
And and when something doesn't have its name, it's a very Japanese sentiment. Like once something loses its name, it essentially loses its power.
right, so he steals Yuhabaha's powers first, leaving him kind of vulnerable. Then he steals his name and then uses his Bankai, which is not a Bankai because it's the first Bankai, but whatever. I don't
Yeah,
mind that so much as an explanation. It's just a weird technical thing.
they're super powerful. It's fine.
Yeah, they're super powerful. It's fine. It's whatever. He uses his Bankai to like reduce Yuhabaha to an ant and then just
A
like
black
knocks
ant.
him out of the Soul Palace. And we cut to black and that's it. And there's like no
Yeah,
coda
it.
whatsoever.
I mean, like, I guess it's just an inevitable problem of adapting the story the way that they're adapting it, but it is a strange place to take it just because, like, everybody watching this, like, more or less knows that, well, I mean, everyone watching it knows that the story is continuing. So it's like to act like it has any kind of finality as like a beat is like, but we're halfway done, guys. Like we're gonna we're gonna keep going. Like,
Yeah.
why are we pretending like all of the threads are tied together here?
And initially, it was using the kind of built-in structure very well because I remember, and this was one point in season one that absolutely floored me, is that when Ichigo gets like knocked out of the Soul Palace, I think it is, there's a couple episodes where after the credits, you get like post-credit scenes of Ichigo
Yes.
doing his thing that are very short and very to the point. And I'm
Hmm.
like, great, that works because if you put it in the episode against all this other shit, I would probably get pissed off. So like
No, totally unimportant.
you're using the format of TV well and editing it well to get all the different beats of the story across, which is legitimately a very difficult thing to do. And I admire you for
Oh
that.
yeah.
But that made it all the more strange that that's how they chose to end things this time around.
I'm thinking that perhaps they just got to a point where they could minimize that sort of cross-cutting technique just because that is so integral to how you edit and pace a story like this, where it's like there are always five different things happening in like three different locations with like two separate sets of characters in this story. So you're inevitably going to encounter an issue like this, but they've been doing it so well up until this point that I think that they just seized the opportunity where it was just like, all right, the least amount of things is happening right now, so we can stop here and then blossom out for the ending. So like, I'm hoping that that's kind of the approach that they'll take, and then the final two parts will end up being on balance a little bit more like well-rounded and complete than two was, because part two very much feels like the it feels like the second act of a story and just the second act. Whereas I feel like part
Yeah.
one almost had like a three-act structure to it, where it was just like introduction and setup, development, destruction of the Soul Society, and then the third act is everybody coming together, training, and being aimed in the right direction. Whereas this is just like everybody fought.
And then it ends. Yeah, it's
Yeah, and
so bizarre because even with all this cross-cutting stuff, like the final episode does take place entirely in the Soul Palace, and like it
mhm.
is a big battle with a lot of moving parts, but it's fewer moving parts than we're used to. So we
Yep.
kind of think we can go for some kind of coda with Yuha Baha, maybe set up a return, do the last 3 seconds of Godzilla -1. I don't give a shit. But but
If
they
it's
don't
emotionally
do anything.
satisfying, it doesn't matter.
But they don't do anything, and it feels
No,
very odd.
it does. And I think that brings us to a point where we should at least speculate as to what the story can do from this point, because like from what I have read, and I haven't read the entirety of the Thousand Year Blood War arc manga, but from what I can tell, this is a pretty straightforward adaptation. Like in terms of the things that
Yeah.
they change, I don't think they change anything. Like maybe the order in which some things take place, or just like very, very small things that ultimately do not matter in the grand scheme of things whatsoever. So my speculation is less like, what they'll do from here going on, unless like, I guess, how they will adapt everything and how it will all end up coming together. And my problem thus far is just that all of the Ichigo stuff so far, broadly speaking, feels perfunctory, and it feels like it's headed in the direction that this stuff is always headed in, just a
Yeah.
diminished form of that, where like, in the Soul Society, this they did like all of the same things were happening, but it worked because A, it was the first time it happened, and B, you didn't have all of this kind of superfluous baggage. It was the first time it was happening, so you didn't have to like take into account that, it's too similar to this arc, or the plot armor thing or whatever. Like the broadest encapsulation of my issues with the Thousand Year Blood War arc, retcons aside, pacing aside, all of those things, it's really just that it feels like Kubo hit a wall with Ichigo. And I feel like there's just not really an attempt to obfuscate this, whereas there is an attempt to make every other part of this, no matter how unoriginal it is, feel super fresh and interesting. And with the way it's headed, like the entire idea that Ichigo is at all connected to our main villain, I think is the problem. Because if he wasn't, if this was just a bad guy who showed up, who had beef with the Soul Reapers, that's fine. Like that is all I need in terms of an antagonist when it comes to this franchise. Having this like, and not to mention turning this on its head and having Ichigo be the defender of the Soul Society, the guy who broke it apart to save his best friend in the start of this story, is a fantastic idea dramatically, because it completely upends what this was to begin with. It's symmetry, it's poetry, it rhymes, etc. But this whole thing with connecting him to his mom and connecting him to Yuabaha, and how like there's just, it's so blanketly dramatically unnecessary, and it keeps emphasizing Ichigo's importance. It keeps emphasizing how like, but the idea, and that's the core issue, is that the reason you and I said that we liked Ichigo as a protagonist, that will defend like his characterization against other shonen protagonists, is that at the end of the day, Ichigo is just a kid who wants to go home. But with Kubo iterating time and time again with these new villains and how they're all connected to Ichigo, it's directly dramatically opposing this principle, where it's just like, yeah, he's just a kid, but he's also part of the Quincy bloodline and part of a Soul Reaper bloodline, and he's also kind of a hollow, and he's also connected to every single antagonist we've ever had. And it's like, just let Ichigo be a kid. He doesn't like this. I hate to circle back to such a broad concept, because it's like, even hating on it's done, but it's just like, we as a society have progressed beyond the need for the chosen one narrative. Like, people have been subverting the chosen one narrative since fucking Harry Potter, since fucking Percy Jackson. These are stories that take the chosen one narrative and are like, actually, we're going to complicate this a little bit because this is a bit tried and true and played out. And we're still doing it, like maybe not in the same like more Western oriented way, but the spirit of it is still here. And I feel like if it abandoned that, this could potentially reach the lofty heights of the Soul Society arc. But as long as it's bound to that, I don't know, frankly.
Yeah, I mean, I want to be optimistic, okay?
Me too,
I want to
because I'm
see this
enjoying
stick the
myself. Like, this
landing.
has been very good so far.
Yeah, I've enjoyed myself. I've overall like enjoyed the process of revisiting this franchise that meant a lot to me and was a big part of why I got
Ditto.
interested in like art from a multicultural perspective, as like stupid
Oh,
as that sounds. Bleach was a
I
big
mean,
gateway for me, and just exploring art from different countries and learning about
I,
different philosophies and how they
it
apply to
was
these things.
was it both of our first like real anime exposure?
I
Like,
was
I
I was
mean,
into Naruto around the same time, but
okay.
like I said, stuff
I
like
got into Dragon
this.
Ball because of the Budokai games, but this was the
Yeah, yeah,
first
yeah, yeah.
anime that I ever sought out, that I was ever like, I need to find and watch episodes of this. Like, and I agree, like it's like revisiting this, warts and all, has been like wonderful. Like, even though there have been parts of it where like I've been like largely disengaged from the experience, like but I've still bare minimum enjoyed myself. And hell, like watching the Thousand Year Blood War arc, like one thing I wanted to save till the end, just because I didn't want to bring this up when we were talking about it in the thick of it, but when the Unohana and Kenpachi thing started happening, I was just like, this is really giving me like Thanatos vibes from my book series, like a little bit. Like there's a chapter. Like, do you see what
Yeah,
I'm
I see
talking
the
about here?
vision. I
Because
do. I
like,
see the
because like
vision.
because like I have a villain in the second series of my book series who is like very philosophically comparable to Kenpachi, and he has a relationship with a character that's kind of like the relationship he's got with Unohana, and I was like, oh God, like even when I beat Kubo to the fucking punch, it's still like it's still the same thing. He comes back with the symmetry.
But no, and I want to make a large point, and it's a point I didn't get at in the last episode. But I mean, I've been thinking a lot about like we live in a horrible, horrible media culture right now. Like
Just awful.
the media environment that we have, at least in this country, for young people is possibly the worst that it has ever been.
I don't mean
Um,
to sound like an old man, but like I feel like the TikTokification of culture is going to manifest terribly for younger generations trying to seek out media, because it's all being commodified into something that's consumable and not necessarily like, you know, designed to be enjoyed as a story. And I'm somebody who's very worried about the commodification of storytelling.
yeah, and like I read all these freaking insider articles about how TV needs to be more boring these days so people can be on
Blech.
their fucking telephone. Get
On your
real.
fucking phone, get
Uh,
real.
and I just it hurts. It makes me hurt as a person that
Mhm.
cares a lot about just all of this, good, bad, and otherwise. And I legitimately would not have gotten as interested in film in the way that I did if not for stuff like Naruto and Bleach leading me to like Akira and leading me towards Japanese cinema in general
Oh
as I
yeah.
got older. And I genuinely think, not that Bleach is like the most child appropriate thing or anything, but just like having this stuff available and building a diverse palette that is able to be consumed, having a feast of stuff on the table is good for a society. And it's why we do what we do in any way that we do it. And like
Everyone needs formative media.
everyone needs
Everybody.
formative media. And that's what this is for us. And that's why we talk about it so passionately, even as we kind of rampantly make fun of it at times.
Well, I think it's because that we make fun of it that kind of makes it special. And also, what makes formative media important is that it also teaches you about the things that you don't like and that you don't get along with it. It makes you sharper as like a consumer, somebody who criticizes things or somebody who expects like, better for something for that. Like Bleach has its, top tier moments that we've spoken to of enjoying about as much as we enjoy anything. But like my critical mindset was shaped by the fact that when I watched Hueco Mundo as a child, I was slightly disappointed by it. And I never got to the heart of why that was until I was slightly older. And then I figured things out. And then it allowed me to take that sort of lens for criticism and apply it other places. And I like that formative media, I think, is important because a lot of people kind of confuse and talk about accessible or formative media in terms of like, oh, well, like it's worse than these other great canon works of art or whatever. And I'm like, yeah, you can think of it like that, but like I think that these things are just as valuable as those because they are messy, because they are like I like that you can take apart certain seasons of shows and say like, this season's great and this season sucks. Or it's why like, you get into shows like Oh, a fucking great example is like, those old like CW shows like Supernatural and shit. Like
Yeah, yeah.
watching the entirety of Supernatural with Rhiannon last year was an incredible experience, not just because I liked the first 4 seasons of that show, a pretty decent deal, but like when the show started to have problems, it started to have so many that it was like trying to engage with critical faculties that I had long since abandoned for like long form media like this. So like even though there are things like season 7 of Supernatural, which made me want to gouge my fucking eyes out, it also had things like season 9 and 10, which I was just kind of like, there are kind of bizarre parts of this that sort of work for me. I don't really know what's happening. And I like being able to find the golden hidden in like, a mountain of shit to be inelegant about it, because you can find something valuable in there. And when you, as a writer or a creator, or even just as a critic, find that something, you can search for that elsewhere. Or if you're a writer, you take what you like and you make it into your own fucking thing. It's what
Yeah.
makes these things so valuable.
And you don't even have to want to make art to deserve stuff that is good. Like, I feel like that's an issue a lot of people who are passionate about the things that we are passionate about run into, where it's like
Yeah.
art is all about how to learn how to make good art, when like that's not the case. At the end of the day, like consuming is a neutral act most of the time. And
Mm-hmm.
so, like, people just deserve things that they can be passionate about and be disappointed by. But that takes an atmosphere that is willing to let people be passionate about the things that they're making, even when they're messy, for people who maybe don't have to take it as seriously as we do, but still it's
Mm-hmm.
there. Like it's important that it's there. And stuff like this is a perfect example of like, I fucking hate Lego sequels. I will rant about them all day long. I hate this trend. I hate it. I don't think it's good for anybody.
No.
But this kind of thing, I kind of see this as a rare exception. I barely even consider it a Lego sequel just because, like, the way it came into being is unnatural for the genre, for this format. And so I'm thinking about it very
Yeah.
differently. And I'm seeing how the story is adapting to kind of a new age of media, as opposed to a new age of media wanting to like drag the story down with it, you know?
It's refreshing to see that Bleach, even after all these years, and even in all the ways that it's subtly changed over the years, is still the same, show that it was in 2005. Which, I mean, you can have your issues with that, but there is still something reassuring about it sticking to a specific format and set of guidelines that it largely excels by. Because I don't think that, like, if it did that approach where modernity dragged Bleach kicking and screaming into the future, I feel like it would clash and then create something that, even if it might not be bad, it would cease to be what it was. So it existing is kind of an anomaly, and a good anomaly at that, just because I like you, like, legacy sequels kind of a tiring concept. I've been burned before, but like in principle, like, there's the idea of like with Hollywood, a lot of the times people are complaining like there's sequels to everything, and now there's legacy sequels to everything. But people are like, why don't you take, things that were bad before and remake them? And the reason that they don't do this is because the things that were bad before didn't make any money. So who the fuck is going to want to remake them? But in principle, artistically, that still makes sense of just like taking an idea that's unrefined and then making it refined. But, it's not something that gets to happen. Also, by extension, the idea of taking something from a previous era, or taking something from, that's just like a slightly outdated media format or whatever, and then, updating it, giving it a new shiny coat of paint, but still preserving what it is, like that's such a fascinating prospect to me. And that's why going back to this has been so refreshing, that even if this ends up disappointing me or burning me in the end, I'm enjoying myself so much in the moment of feeling like I'm 12 again and waiting to see the next episode of the Karakura Town arc on Adult Swim, and
At
then
midnight
eventually
on
getting to,
Saturday night, and I'm
yep,
fighting myself to stay awake.
and stay awake and get to Bleach and Cowboy Bebop and Full Metal Alchemist Brotherhood, and just have the best fucking night of my week that I've been looking forward to, because I had a hard spelling test and that shit sucked ass. That kind of shit. And now it's the same thing. It's just that you work 44 hours a week instead of going to school. So
Well,
this has been
I
our thesis on why outdated media needs to come back. I mean, but that isn't that kind of a trend though, now that I really think about it, is that like we're seeing like a resurgence of things like vinyl, of things like cassette. We're seeing things like just like the past is starting to rear its head in ways that it doesn't feel like for the sake of just like novelty or retro something, but because something about it stuck out, because something about it was special and something about it wants to be preserved, or someone latched onto something about it and is now bringing it forward. And I hope that this trend continues because I like, again, Lego sequels, no, but this idea of making something more complicated and more messy, that's what I'm all for, because we love mess. This is
yes,
our entire thing here. We love mess.
we wouldn't spend so much time talking about stuff like Evangelion and Twin Peaks, even stuff that are seen as like arbiters of their respective mediums, if they weren't like messy and had real appeal and texture to them, warts and
Mm-hmm.
all. And that's a phrase that we keep coming back to. And I feel like that's a phrase that defines a lot of our favorite things, like
I agree.
looking back to some of the conversations that we've had about things, on and off this recording about Brockhampton or M. Night Shyamalan or whatever the fuck.
Yep.
Like, we get invested in stuff that is messy because we feel that there's passion behind it, and everybody deserves to experience things that have passion behind them. And I feel like we're running out of that.
I
At least
I feel
we're
like
running out of stuff.
we value passion as much as we value quality.
Yeah. And I feel like we're running out of stuff that is passionate, that is aiming at the age group that we were in when we
Mm-hmm.
discovered this stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Because all these fucking studios think that TikTok and YouTube or whatever is gonna do it for them, and
Our
it's
movie is going to
not.
make enough money, so let's put it in the garbage before it's even released.
Let's put all of The Sopranos on TikTok. Do you know how it feels to be watching The Sopranos for the first time and seeing that headline? I'm only like a third of the way through The Sopranos, and now it's on TikTok. I can just watch it for
I
free.
that's a dystopian prospect. Like I try to balance out my knowing that there is inevitable change in the landscape of how art works and will be consumed, but also like I don't want that change to come at the cost of the creation or the cost of the
Yeah.
creator. So
And the
it's why relishing this stuff is so like important and valuable, and why like a lot of my favorite things are things that I put on like the top tier, things that are like Full Metal Alchemist Brotherhood, for example, the show I wouldn't have discovered without Bleach, like directly. I wouldn't have. Like the first 13 episodes of that show are an abridged version of the story because they were like, oh, we already did this technically with the 2003 show and we don't want to repeat ourselves, so let's kind of speed run our way through the story. So it's a little awkward there at the beginning, and I still think it's the greatest work of art I've ever consumed in my life. Hunter x Hunter is probably the second greatest work of art I've ever consumed in my life, and each season of that show is a completely different genre with a completely different tone, and it has pacing that is all over the fucking place, and debatably you don't even get to the most essential part of the show until about 100 episodes into it, and I still think that everyone alive should watch it because it will change your life.
and another thing I respect about all of this stuff that again I feel like I'm seeing a lack of in stuff in media directed for this age group that we keep talking about is like stuff that's willing to stick to its guns, which is the thing that I respect about Bleach and the thing that we've talked about all the time without realizing it at first of like
Mhm.
we as creators but also just as people who like stuff love a creator like Kubo who is willing to stick to what he wants to do and just keep doing it until he feels good about ending it. And that is a quality that defines so many artists and frankly just like people in my personal life that I enjoy being around. And so much
Yeah.
media nowadays, once there's a misstep, it's like you're done, you're out. Whether
Hmm.
it's, shows getting canceled or just stuff that has a weirdly sardonic tone to it about its audience, the whole like
Yeah.
wink, wink, nudge, nudge attitude that we're seeing in stuff directed towards younger audiences constantly. Like, people are going to grow, people of this generation, people who have grown up post Shrek are going to like grow up and realize that they've been condescended to their whole life by everything they have ever thought they enjoyed. And exceptions often prove the rule. I like stuff that's a little bit self-aware. Obviously, we've talked about that quality in some works that we enjoy, but it's just such a pervasive quality that there's a lack of sincerity to stuff
That's
that we're making, and I can't stand it.
that's a running theme on the Jams and Tea podcast too, is that if you've heard Morgan complain about one thing, it's that there's so much art and music and shit these days that is just irony poisoned to the point where engaging with it just becomes like sticking your head in a tumble dryer, and it just becomes impossible to meaningfully engage with if you want to be even remotely sincere with yourself. And it's just like we live in fraught times. And all I'm saying is sincerity helps ground me. It helps me feel at ease with the world. It helps me get on the wavelength of the people around me, and it creates a communal appreciation for something that we all understand. And I'm not saying that I want that to be the only thing, because I don't, but I am sincerely worried about the way that it has been diminished. And that's why I think the two of us latch onto something like Bleach so strongly, is because Bleach is so unapologetically sincere. So much of shonen is like defined by the fact that it is overwhelmingly sincere, more than like any other quality that it has, which is like why I think I'm so receptive to it still. It's why I can go back and enjoy stuff like My Hero or Demon Slayer, for instance, just because it's playing on classic storytelling tropes that I get along with, and a lot of it's really well animated and looks nice, has nice characters and all, but just the notion that somebody passionate wants to display their passion is like a weird kind of novelty. I mean, I'm fuck. One of my favorite movies of last year is a movie I saw with you, Godzilla minus one, and it's because that movie is
Absolutely.
like blindingly sincere about everything that it's about, and it's why like for example, good God, we're really going back to all of the things we've covered here. It's why I still really like this, mind you, but like it's why the two most modern takes on Godzilla that have happened, I lean towards minus one because it's more sincere, whereas Anno's take on a modern Godzilla is very self-aware and very much about like, poking fun at its own interiority and stuff. It's like, not to say it's devoid of those things or that Anno is devoid of those things, but it's kind of like it stands like Thousand Year Blood War is almost like an effective counter to something like the Rebuild movies when I really think about it, because it's an author who's going back revisiting their old work, but he doesn't have any illusions about what he's doing. He's not trying to update this with a coat of paint to be like, oh, this is a new spin on this.
It's
It's like,
new
no,
and it's
it's the
better,
same thing.
it's
it's
not.
it's the old Bleach. It's a new chapter in the story. That's all it is.
Yeah, I mean, in the same way that in the same rush that I get for the first time of getting to the part in the Waco Mundo arc where it shifts from like 4 by 3 to 16 by 9, and it feels like the
Hell yeah.
whole show, just the chemistry is completely altered, but like the heart is still there. That's kind of the same way I feel about this, where like even with all the, improved animation and the changes in the structure, like as much as you change the exterior, it's the same hearts and the same
Hmm.
brain on the inside that's driving the whole thing forward. And so it makes the exterior, more surface level changes feel like they're coming from a more genuine place of like wanting to do justice to the inside. And we
And
don't
that's,
get a lot of that anymore.
and that's not to say that it abandons, the problems that it might have in the past. Like I remember feeling a weird sense of nostalgia when like, Ron Giku will sexually harass another character where it's just like, do I like this aspect of storytelling? Not particularly. Do I find a weird sense of comfort in it? Because when I was 12 years old and I was just like, why is that big boob lady hugging everybody? And I felt that again, and I was just kind of like, something the more things change, the more things stay the same. And that's a little magical sometimes, a little tiny bit. Um, this is really kind of circumnavigating back into like the thick of the discussion, but I'm curious just because we are two non-traditionally gendered individuals. Um, what's our take on a certain character's portrayal in specifically part two and the way that it's been talked about? Because there's one character who is one of the Sternritters who I've seen a lot of nasty, transphobic discussion about. And I'm curious to get your take. It's the one character who's confirmed to be a cross dresser, but is
I'm
like,
gonna be so for real. I have no idea what you're talking
really?
about.
Okay. Well, then
I have not heard any discussion about this online. I have our
this
one
this is
mutual, you know who I'm thinking of, who's a
yes,
major Bleach fan. But other
this is
than
what
that, I'm like
happens
not
when
engaged
you
at all.
passively scroll on different subreddits. Um, don't do Reddit, kids. Never once. Not even once.
Don't do Reddit.
Not even once. The most sexualized which already kind of presents a problem of the Sternritters. I think I because I get their names mixed up, I forget it. It's either Giselle or Bambietta. I think it's Giselle.
Yeah, one of those two.
But is like it's very difficult. Like within the text of the piece, they are referred to as a cross-dressing man, but like in effect, the character's just trans. And then of course this sparked a lot of debate because anime fans are like the most like outlandishly transphobic people on planet Earth. And
Hmm.
that was a discussion that got particularly ugly many different times. Whereas what I can perceive is that it's just kind of like trying to perceive the gender and sexual politics of Japanese media is a real fucking like it's a minefield. I don't necessarily want to wade into it or anything, but just as somebody who is the way that they are, I was curious just because Bleach has always been a show where like it's always approximated sexuality in ways that anime traditionally I found to be like kind of avoidant of it just because one thing that I've kind of appreciated as I've gotten older is that like there's some anime that exist and then like their fan service is like entirely non-diegetic. It's for the audience only, and the sexuality of the characters has nothing to do with like the internal like continuity of the characters. Like their sexuality exists for the audience and not for the other characters within the show.
Yeah,
And
I hear
that
what you're
always
saying.
bothers me. Whereas like I'm a little bit more lenient on like fan service and aggressive displays of sexuality in anime if it's well written to be within the context of the show. And the curious thing about Bleach is that like for the most part it is within the context of the show. It's just
Yeah.
very surface level. Like it certainly is acknowledged, but it's always like there are always like the thing that kills me about lots of other anime is that like the main protagonist will always be like, "Oh my God, boobs. I'm so scared. I can't look, my nose bleeds." And I'm just like, as a 14-year-old, like as a former 14-year-old boy, who the fuck is gonna stand there with all like Ichigo being all like, "Oh no, not Yoruichi's boobs." I'm like, there is no teenager alive that is going to react this way. None of them, unless every anime main character in the world are all asexual, which I don't believe any of you are forward thinking enough to make that a present element of your character writing, but like just that idea that like all of these adolescent teenagers are just like, no, not sexuality, has always been something that I'm like, whatever.
All
So
right.
I've always kind of liked it, but it's with Bleach, it's always messy. Like they had that one token lesbian character who's like, whenever she shows up in the filler episodes, it's like really aggressive and like, okay, maybe we need to tone this down just a tiny little bit, guys. But it's very strange. I was curious to get your read on the overall sexual politics of the show through the lens of this one particular character.
Yeah. I mean, like I said, this is gonna be me just kind of shooting from the hip because I've not followed any of
Yeah,
this.
same.
Um, but I think for me, as somebody who has gone through some of the, big name titles, but not all of them, Bleach does for me have a pretty unique portrayal of interpersonal relationships. And like we've talked about that with regard to Soul Society before, where like all the characters have kind of this big web where like everybody kind of has a relationship with everybody.
Yeah.
Um, but in the moments where Bleach really leans into intimacy, which for the uninitiated, few and far between. Um,
I minor problem with this new arc that I think is kind of a missed opportunity. I don't like why are Ichigo and Orihime like just sidelined to like such an egregious degree?
they are
Like
not going to be able to get them married by the end of this.
no, no,
They are
like
not going to sell
even
me on that by the end of this.
like if you're wondering like, hey, Ichigo and Orihime are a couple, you didn't bring that up until now. Yeah, that's the point. It's kind of the problem is that the show doesn't really bring it up either.
Yeah, but anyway, and I've seen this happen before where like Western weeboo fans of a thing get really weird about certain characters. I've seen it happen with like, and I don't keep up with this fandom at all, but there's just one I can shoot off the top of my head, like Guilty Gear and that one
Yeah, I
character.
remember that happening as well,
Um,
and it was the same thing. And for the record, if any of you are in the comments, I will be deleting anything that is even mildly transphobic, so piss off.
yeah, goodbye. But as somebody that didn't have any idea that this was going on, I did have a weird vibe about Giselle and Bambietta, just because they have a weird kind of almost sadomasochism thing going on, but
Yeah,
it's
I definitely
portrayed,
got that.
as kind of one-sided and if I'm remembering things correctly, like borderline non-consensual.
Yeah, a little bit. I didn't even really think about that until now, but you're right. There's definitely like a and I'm wondering if maybe it's just manifesting in this one character taking out these tendencies on this one character in particular because she's that character, or because they do that to everyone around them and we're just seeing it manifest in this one way. So I'm not sure how far reaching those implications are, but it is definitely a present element. And
No,
yeah.
it's a curious portrayal because I will like I can firmly say that anime at least is nowhere near where a lot of media is in terms of explorations of queer characters, ideas, and themes. Purely in terms of quantity, I don't mean that as a statement about quality because we'll be here all day. And I frankly don't feel like getting into that. I'm talking kind of purely quantitative here. And
No.
so it is interesting to see a character like that. And I don't want to just turn a blind eye to it. But the fact is, that character is present for so little of the narrative that it kind of doesn't matter. And anybody making a big deal out of it is more likely offended by it than not for existing the way that they think it is.
Yes. It,
And so
it
I,
it's very strange just because in a show like Bleach that I mean like as I made a point of earlier, which is like very celebrative of like the concept of diversity, just because they're like, I know that specifically Bleach is a very popular anime amongst like cosplayers and stuff, just because like it doesn't matter what gender or color you fucking are, there is somebody in Bleach you can cosplay, and they will probably have like a variation of a quite unique character design, just because even everybody in the Soul Society who largely have the same uniforms all have a distinct like look or alteration to their costume that is very specific to them or something. So it focuses on individuality a lot. So I think it sort of behooves the creation of the universe itself to be like, yeah, of course there should be like queer characters in this universe because there's characters of everything. There's a fucking fox man. Of course there
I
should
mean,
be a
and we
fucking
do have, I will give Kubo credit. We do have Yoruichi and Soifan, which in my
yes.
mind, very ahead of its time for this genre.
Yes.
But
Yeah.
that's not a thing that's been dwelled on, and so it's easy to
Mm-mm.
overlook.
I think that has to do with the fact that I feel like that like romantic intimacy is not something Kubo likes to write. Like, and I
I
don't
don't
say
think it's
that
a
as
thing
like
he's interested in, which is why
ex
I don't feel like
precisely.
overly interrogating his portrayal of it.
Yeah, it's why like I can understand like finding it to be a weakness just because it's like establishing that Ichigo and Orihime are a thing and then promptly ignoring that for the rest of the foreseeable future is a strange choice, but it's also something that I would rather not really be in there at all if he's not interested in it. It's just because that's just not like I don't even think many characters in Bleach have like romance as a part of like their backstory. Like, can you even name like five characters where that's like Ichigo's parents and like Byakuya?
Yeah,
Like,
Byakuya has somebody, Momo has a crush on Aizen. We talked about that in the last episode.
mm-hmm,
But like it's not a huge defining part of Bleach's world. And
mm-hmm,
that's largely not a thing that bothers me all that
mm-hmm.
much.
Not really, no.
But so
Like
like
I could understand like why it would bother someone, but it's just not where the strengths of this universe lie for me, I guess.
I would rather Kubo not bother than try and make it a thing that takes up
Fumble.
way too much time and is messy and
Mm-mm.
awkward and easily would stick out as the worst part of the show. But
Nah, I'm good.
to wrap up all of this in preparation for, do we want to do part three by itself or do we want to just wait and do three and
I
four
think we should do
together?
part three and four because with just part three, we risk having a part two situation where we are dwelling on something where it's like a lot of minutia and in the moment developments, but not a lot of actual plot happening. Because like
Yeah.
they're just as long as each other, but there's a lot more to talk about in part one. So I feel like doing it into halves is probably the smartest way to go.
Yeah. So we'll be back whenever part four comes out. I promise it will be more prompt than it was between when part two got released because we did kind of intentionally wait for part two to get finished after a certain point.
Yeah,
But anyway, to put a pin in all this, we've talked about a lot, mainly just because like I
there
didn't
is a
want this
lot
to.
to talk about.
Yeah, there's a lot to talk about. I didn't want this to feel incomplete as an episode because the show is not incomplete, which is why I got off on that
Exactly.
whack ass tangent because
No,
I think it
ditto.
still rings true, and frankly, it saves us time in the next part. Uh,
Mhm.
but I'm still looking forward to it. I want to see where it goes next. Warts and all, I'm still really invested in this, and I've been
Absolutely.
enjoying it.
It's such a it's such a rich text.
It
I don't
is
know.
like
It's
it's
very
stuff like
affirming.
this. It's stuff like this that when you really start to get under the surface of, just because of its nature, you can really find a lot of stuff to talk about. Like before you brought it up, I had never even thought to talk about the portrayal of romance as an idea in Bleach as a whole, which is a thing that I think Shonen as a whole largely struggles with, and this is an interesting case of
God,
how it
is there
renders
like a really
itself.
good shonen romance example?
Uh, Naruto and Hinata make it work towards the end.
It's pretty solid, I would say.
But that is
The
also a
the pro,
ninth hour. That one's a
the
ninth hour
progenitor for all
turn,
this
though.
is Goku and uh Chi-Chi, which is maybe the funniest progenitor relationship because of how also swept under the rug it is.
Yeah.
It's like Chi-Chi is a baby machine now, and this relationship doesn't matter.
Yeah. But no, I mean
She's going to birth more important characters now. Oh no.
Oh no. No, but I'm feeling good about this. I'm ready for the last of it to come out. I'm kind of pumped to see how this
Me too.
ends. I want to feel good about this at the end of the day.
Me too. Like, and I'm anticipating like because I've known how it ends, and on the surface, I don't love the idea of it, but I want to see it in execution to wait till I finalize any of my thoughts whatsoever. Just because that's the prime thing with Bleach here. Then the reason it's so worth talking about is that talking about its ideas in broad strokes isn't always particularly helpful because it's often the execution that makes or breaks it. Because I mean, like we talked about the fact that there's plenty of ideas, even in this arc alone, that on paper sound like ridiculously stupid, just like terrible ideas. I would never give the advice of what Kubo does here to any like just random writer writing their own stories, like not in a million years. But the fact that he knows how to do what he's doing makes these choices work. And somehow, some way, it manages to make something greater than the sum of its parts.
Yeah, and that's what Bleach has always been for us, I think, is something greater than the sum of its parts. And we've always drawn that line in the sand between concept and execution, which is frankly, I don't think a unique thing to have to do with an anime. So
No,
let's see where it goes.
hell yeah. Let's see. Let's see.
All right, everybody. Thanks for watching. Like and subscribe. Don't leave transphobic shit in the comments. Rock over London. Rock on
Rock on
Chicago.
Chicago.
I need a phrase.
Uh,
Um,
does Crunchyroll have a tagline?
that's a good question. I'm gonna look. Slogan. And as always, rock over London, rock on Chicago, Crunchyroll. We help everyone belong. That's our mission.
All right, then. That's a direct little mission there.